Hello, and welcome to the presentation on the Children and Family Policy sector. Presenting today will be Charlene King, Emily McLean, and Angie Salt. I will be focusing on the chapter highlights, including history, laws, and core problems. Emily will talk about major problem and policy, data, and social work responses, and Angie will finish us off with policy intervention, including micro, meso, and macro. The child welfare system has served as a safety net for children who have been abused or neglected. This chapter highlighted this policy sector in the U.S. This slide shows how child welfare policies have evolved over the last few centuries. In the 17th century, the idea of parens patriae, or that the government or any other authority, regarded as the legal protector of citizens unable to protect themselves, was used to justify the removal of children from their parents and place them with other families. This concept continues to be used to justify the intervention of the courts to protect children. In the 1800s, many children were abandoned or sent to almshouses to live with others who were poor, sick, or insane. Concerns for the children living in these horrible conditions laid the groundwork for orphanages and children's asylums. In 1853, the Children's Aid Society was founded by Yale graduate Charles Loring Brace, with monetary support from New York businessmen and philanthropists. Their goal was to ensure the physical and emotional well-being of children and to provide them with the supports they needed to become successful adults. Brace was appalled by the thousands of abandoned and abused children living in slums and on the streets of New York. He believed that institutional care was detrimental to the children and felt that only work, education, and a strong family bond could ensure that they developed into successful citizens. He arranged for the children to be sent with American pioneers as they settled the West. This became known as the Orphan Train Movement. The children arrived in towns where community leaders assembled interested community members to inspect and select the children that they wanted. From 1853 to 1929, more than 200,000 children rode the orphan train. The New York Society for the Prevention of the Cruelty of Children was started in 1874 in response to the fact that there were no child protective service agencies or juvenile courts to intervene on behalf of a child who had been physically abused or neglected. Although there were hundreds of anti-cruelty societies intervening legally to protect children, the government was very slow to take over the responsibility of protecting abused children. In 1921, the Child Welfare League was formed. The Social Security Act, Title IV, had the government becoming a major funding source for children's programs. The Title 20 Amendment in 1975 provided states the flexibility to fund social service programs for children and families, fund children in foster care who had special needs, and funding for foster parents to receive extra services that were not provided in the past. The Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974 was passed to provide financial aid to programs for prevention, detection, and treatment of child abuse and neglect. It also established the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. I will not go into details of the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, as we have already dissected this topic earlier in the semester. The 1980s brought amendments to the Social Security Act that provided federal subsidies for the adoption of children from foster care, reducing the financial burdens that had deterred many from adopting children in the past. The Adoption and Safe Families Act established a timeline for the permanency of children in foster care, and the Affordable Care Act has allowed former foster children who have aged out of the system to continue to receive Medicaid coverage until the age of 26. Protection of children's rights is a very real problem, as many are not made aware of their rights while in foster care. All children in care are entitled to a Bill of Rights. Many of these rights are outlined in the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997 and address the child's safety and well-being. Some of the rights are as follows. 1. To live in a safe, healthy, and comfortable home where they are treated with respect. 2. To receive medical, dental, vision, and mental health services. 3. to be free of the administration of medication or chemical substances unless authorized by a physician. 4. To contact family members unless prohibited by court order. 5. To visit and contact siblings unless prohibited by court order. 6. To make and receive confidential telephone calls and receive and send unopened mail unless prohibited by court order. 7. To attend religious services and activities of their choice. 8. To attend school and participate in extracurricular, cultural, and personal enrichment activities consistent with their age and development. 9. To attend court hearing and speak to the judge. 10. At 16 years of age or older, to have access to existing information regarding educational options available, including but not limited to the coursework necessary for vocational and post-secondary education programs and financial aid. While the number of children requiring services increase exponentially every year, the funding does not always match the demand. While resources being sparse, agencies have to strive to use them in the most cost-effective manner to maintain accessibility to the services that are necessary to meet their clients' needs. The Child and Family Services Improvement Act of 2006 amended the Social Security Act Title IV-B to all for the expansion and flexibility of services. States were permitted to make changes to better serve their population and address their ever-changing needs. In the U.S., approximately 700,000 children end up in foster care every year due to abuse and neglect. Some may be reunited with their families of origin, but many linger in the foster care system until they age out. Roughly 20,000 18-year-olds leave foster care every year, and many are unprepared for the responsibilities and burdens of being an adult. The Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997 extended independent living services to children whose assets do not exceed $5,000. The previous cap was $1,000. The services are also to be designed to assist young people in preparing to live independently when they leave foster care. Child Protective Services is reactive and gets involved after the abuse has already occurred. Child welfare is a multidimensional problem and can have origins in other problems that are embedded in the family or society as a whole. Jansen identified a natural correlation between welfare and the child welfare systems. More than half of the children who enter the child welfare system are from families that are eligible for welfare. Children raised in poverty are at an increased risk for abuse and neglect. It is essential to prevent child abuse and neglect, as they both have found to be negatively affecting attachment and aggression in children. The Adoption, Assistance, and Child Welfare Act of 1980 was a direct response to the inadequate functioning of the child welfare system. Its amendments to the Title IV-A and Title IV-B and created Title IV-E of the Social Security Act, shifting the focus from detection to the prevention of child abuse and permanence planning for children in out-of-home placement. While programs have allowed some children to remain in foster care until the age of 21, they are then forced to leave without any concrete relationships with biological or adopted parental figures. Instead of gradually entering adulthood with the continued support from their parents, these teenagers are expected to become independent with very little to no outside supports. In 2015, over 20,000 teenagers were emancipated out of foster care in the U.S. These children are at higher risk for numerous problems into adulthood. They are at increased risk of needing public assistance and for becoming homeless. They are also more likely than their peers to have mental or physical health problems that affect their functioning. They are at greater risk of abusing drugs and alcohol and have higher rates of criminal behavior. The Adoption and Safe Families Act was signed into law in 1997 under the Clinton administration. While the law mainly addressed the issue of finding permanent placement for foster children more quickly, it requires that states document their attempts to find permanent placements, including suitable and willing relatives. ASFA addressed concerns that children were being left in unsafe situations while rehabilitative measures were attempted with the family. It also addressed the perceived reluctance of agencies and judges to terminate a parent's rights and seek adoption in a timely manner. the emphasis was shifted to the need for continued efforts to find permanent homes for the children. The Fostering Connections to Seeking and Increasing Adoption Act of 2008 allowed states the option to pay for the use of kinship or relative foster care. The Fostering Connections Act also places an emphasis on the need to find permanent homes with those who the child may already have a connection with. These efforts are now tied to the disbursement of the Title IV-E money. The Family First Prevention Services Act is very similar to the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, in that children should be placed in homes that have the same social and cultural values as the child's biological home. This act further ties Title IV-E monies to agencies' efforts in finding and maintaining kinship connections for youth in foster care. This does not necessarily mean that these children must be placed in the home of kinship, but that relatives and other significant parties are able to and should maintain some sort of connection to the child.
There are several causes to the social problem of children aging out of foster care without a connection to biological family. Some of the biggest issues, particularly in the U.S., are our treatment around mental health and drug and alcohol problems. When children are removed in the first place, many of them have parents who have a substance abuse problem or a mental health issue, which makes it difficult for parents to immediately reobtain custody and care. These parents are struggling to manage their children in the home, and some of their own challenges can block the reobtainment of care from their children. This challenge of parents having ongoing struggles makes the need for care sometimes long-term, which kinship is not always able or willing to do. So that creates a challenge with children being placed into foster care and then bouncing from home to home and then aging out with no connection to biological family because there have not been any suitable caretakers to care for these children all the way up to adulthood. So, as we stated before, the bouncing from foster home to foster home is common. There are also different views culturally on the issue of children aging out with no connection to biological family. So, for example, in Spain, according to one study, kinship care makes up almost 45% of living situations for the children that are placed out of their home. This appears to be the case in Spain because of the lengthy and complicated process that is the family foster care system, and this country responds by really putting a high emphasis on kinship care and maintaining a connection to family. That's not always the case, particularly in the U.S. Many family members are also struggling with the same challenge, and particularly if there's more than one child, it becomes more and more difficult to take on. So some of the things that cause this social problem are just a really large gap in our U.S. healthcare system, the treatment of mental health and drug and alcohol issues, and our family values in this country and our culture on really kind of it taking a village and rallying around a family to help raise a child. There is some very intense data around children aging out of the foster care system and just how at capacity the system really is and how complicated it really has become. In 2015 alone, 20,289 teenagers were emancipated out of the foster care system, meaning just that they emancipated themselves, they were out of the system. Over 20,000, which is a really large number. About 1 in 4 kids who age out of the system will not graduate from high school or be able to pass their GED. There's a lot of challenges around not having access to the information and the education necessary. Even if one wanted to pass their GED, there is a lot of training and materials that are required around that. And when a child ages out too often, they age out without the necessary skills to continue their education. 50% of children aging out of the foster care system have a mental health diagnosis. This should not be surprising. There are a lot of genetic ties too, and because many parents who lose custody of their children suffer from a mental health diagnosis, it's not entirely surprising that there are children who age out suffering from a mental health diagnosis and who more than likely do not have access to the necessary medical care to treat the mental health issues. So there again, there's a perpetuation of a really difficult cycle. And up to 46% of former foster children have been homeless for at least one night as an adult, that one really surprised me. That really is a challenging situation. Almost half of all foster children have spent a night homeless as an adult. And just what that says about our country's ability to kind of take care of homeless people and people that don't have what they need, and our country's ability to notice high-risk populations and do what they need to do to care for them. That's way too high a number. So that data really gives insight into how challenged many of these children are with the circumstances that they face when they age out. Vulnerable populations are especially susceptible to having to deal with this social problem. Some of the populations that are vulnerable are children in the foster care system, obviously, and they are already at risk due to having had experienced circumstances that cause them to be removed from their homes in the first place. So this could be drug and alcohol use of a parent, unsanitary home conditions, physical abuse, a number of different things. But being removed is obviously traumatic in and of itself. Boys are particularly vulnerable once they age out, and almost 60% of boys who age out of the system are legally emancipated, and they've been convicted of a crime. So 60% is a really high number to be convicted of a crime when they age out. Children who are Caucasian also tend to be less resilient in the foster care system, and thus tend to have more difficulty making transitions out of the system. Struggling with income, getting a job, crimes, etc. There's also a vulnerability among teenage girls when they age out. 7 out of 10 girls who age out of the system become pregnant before the age of 21. And again, statistically, when those girls have children, those children are at a higher risk of having system involvement and babies that are less healthy, etc. Social work responds to the issue of children aging out in a number of different ways, particularly by implementing legislation. The Family First Prevention Service Act seeks to develop a stronger connection between children in foster care and their biological families. In some cases, termination of parental rights occurs, but courts do try to prevent this if at all possible. At the onset of a child's placement, parent-child visitation is arranged to facilitate the ongoing familial connection and bond. It is identified that the purpose of a contact between the children and their biological family should be defined and weighed against any possible harm or negative effects from the continued contact. Continued contact can help to maintain the child's sense of identity, improve relationships between the parent and the child, and or resolve any attachment issues so that the child does not feel that they have been rejected, but this is only advised if the benefits outweigh the possible negative consequences. The field of social work also responds by attempting to place children with suitable family members before placing them in foster care. Kinship care minimizes the trauma and the sense of loss that children feel when they are removed from the care of their parents. Parents of children in kinship care are more likely to visit than parents of children in traditional foster care.
We looked at policy interventions at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. At the federal level, we talked about earlier the Family First Prevention Services Act, which was signed into law as part of the Bipartisan Budget Act on February 9, 2018. This bill aims to prevent children from entering foster care by allowing federal reimbursement for mental health services, substance use treatment, and in-home parenting skill training. It also seeks to improve the well-being of children already in foster care by incentivizing states to reduce placement of children in congregate care. There are several parts to this act. The first one is the prevention activity, so looking at services to allow the child to safely remain in their home or in a kinship placement. There's another part of the Act that looks at enhanced support, and that deals a little bit about family reunification and state requirements. Another section is ensuring the necessity of a placement that is not in a foster family home. And with this, they're looking at these group homes and situations where it's multiple children living in an environment that's not a foster family or biological family. So they're trying to keep the amount of time that children are in group homes limited. So they're providing incentives for that. There's a section continuing support for child and family services, and then continuing incentives to states to promote adoption and legal guardianship. So they're providing incentives to the state to continue to promote adopting children and looking at guardianship options for these children. Another federal intervention is the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act of 2008. This was signed into law on October 7th of 2008. And this act looks at connecting and supporting relative caregivers. They're trying to improve outcomes for children in foster care, providing for tribal foster care and adoption access, and improving incentives for adoption. This law is looking more into how can we keep these children in home with a relative caregiver. So it may not necessarily be a biological parent, but another family member. It looks into the laws with the tribal foster care and making sure that they have access to adoption services. At the state level, we looked at the Chaffee Foster Care Independence Program. The Department of Human Services in Pennsylvania and the Office of Children, Youth, and Families is the single state agency designated to administer and supervise this independent program. The Independent Living Program is funded with Title IV-E state and local funds. It's state supervised, county administered, and it prepares youth in foster care from the ages of 16 to 21 for their transition from foster care to independent living. The Independent Living Program is operated statewide, and all county children and youth agencies are required by regulation to provide independent living services to youth in their custody. The Department of Human Services works to provide youth the support that they need in making that transition from placement to self-sufficiency. So, giving them the skills and the resources that they need to become independent and also to become productive members of society. They make every effort possible to reduce or eliminate the instances of homelessness, poverty, delinquent or criminal behavior, non-marital childbirth, and to increase employability, high school graduation rates, enrollment in post-secondary or vocational institution. All of these things hopefully leading to a successful transition to adulthood. So this came into effect after studies were done, looking at the rates of homelessness and poverty, the rates of unemployment and criminal behavior in adolescents that have aged out of the foster care system without support. So this was started to try to combat that, to help these kids, again, become productive members of society. There are regulations to this. To be eligible for the independent living services in Pennsylvania, you have to be between the ages of 16 and 21. You have to be in or have been in out-of-home placement on or after the age of 16. All counties in Pennsylvania are required to offer some level of service and support to youth between the ages of 18 to 20 as well. This doesn't seem to be regulated quite as much from the information that I looked at. The types and levels of services and supports for the children from the ages 18 to 20 varies by county programs. At the local level, we looked at the Lancaster County Children and Youth Social Services. They provide multiple services within Lancaster County. First is child abuse and child neglect investigations. So children and youth workers must investigate all reports of child abuse that are made. And our state has a child line system that they can use to do that. They go out to investigate to assure the safety of the child, conduct an investigation into the report, and they also develop a plan with the family to help them work on any problems that may exist in that home. Caseworkers also investigate complaints of child neglect and dependency. There's also in-home protective services, and these services are provided to families who have shown to need some supportive caseworker help in order to maintain a healthy and appropriate level of parenting. They may receive intensive protective services if there's a high risk of that child being placed. So they're really working with the families trying to prevent that child from being removed from the home. Lancaster County Children and Youth Services also has a foster care, residential placement, and adoption service program. The purpose of foster care is to allow the children to live with other families when it becomes impossible for the child's biological parents to provide for them their basic needs. The foster family is there to provide a warm, nurturing home until the natural family can once again care for the children. So the ultimate goal is to get them back to their biological parents if that's deemed safe. They also deal with residential placement. When a child requires highly structured, supervised 24-hour care, a residential or group home facility may be the best intervention for them at that time. It's usually kids that have serious behavior or emotional difficulties and are not able to be cared for by a family in a home-like setting. The agency's ultimate goal was to get these children back into that kind of setting or to independent living if they're of that age. But they do use the residential placements if needed. The children and youth also deal with adoption. They primarily work with kids who are in foster care and need of finding a permanent family. So they work with that, and they offer adoption subsidies for children who may qualify. And they also do have the independent living services, and they make referrals for counseling, educational services, and emergency services for needs like housing, food, and clothing. So they're required to do that under that last act that I talked about. For the proposed intervention, we talked about a mentoring program, and we were looking at this more at the local level, so at a micro, individual, family-based level. We would be looking in Lancaster County as these services being provided by an agency like Lancaster County Children and Youth Social Services. These services would work with the family more intensely on first building a relationship with the social worker, having the same social worker coming out, mentoring these parents, establishing a relationship that's built on trust and respect on both parts. And that initially may not be easy to do, so that's why we're looking at having something a little bit longer term for the families. We would work on empowering the parents and teaching them, what healthy boundaries are, what healthy relationships look like, getting them the services that they need for themselves to be healthy so that they're able to take care of their children and the children would be safe and well cared for in that environment. We'd probably be looking at children that are already in in-home protective services because those children have already been recognized by the county as needing supportive caseworkers. So we would look at doing that a little bit more intensely and really looking at strengthening those long-term relationships with the social worker. And, as they begin to make progress, continuing to work with them to ensure that that continues and that the child is safely able to stay in that home. Social workers have to consider several groups when addressing the social problem. The feelings of the biological parents need to be considered, as well as the feelings of the children, the kinship placement, or the foster family that is caring for the child. It's important for us as social workers to understand the biological parent's perspective. They may be struggling with substance abuse or mental health diagnoses that may make it difficult for them to be able to care for their children. And even though we set services in place for them, it may be difficult for them to follow these services appropriately because of the issues that they're dealing with. So it's important to be able to remain empathetic and to try to understand the emotional needs of that parent. The children also need to be cared for appropriately as far as dealing with feelings that may arise from being involved in the system. Many children have come from homes where they may have been neglected or already experienced abuse. So they may already have traumatic experiences in their past, but then they're taken away from the only home that they may have known, which is another traumatic experience for them. So it's important for them to be able to have someone to talk to. These children may be experiencing anger, sadness, fear, and may even still feel protective of the parents that they have been removed from. So it's important to understand this so that we're able to provide the services that that child needs, such as counseling. Another group that we need to consider the feelings of is the foster family. It can be especially difficult for the family when they're reunifying the children or facilitating visitation with the biological parents, especially if it's still not a healthy environment for that child. That transition can be difficult for a foster family when that child actually goes back to the home. So it's important to understand their point of view and try to get their perspective in this situation. Our first question is, how can social workers better address clients' unique needs when determining what services are needed? And specifically looking at the intervention that we proposed, what can social workers do to make sure that they're getting the services set up for the family? Our second discussion question is, discuss some of the difficulties that can arise in the relationship between the social worker and the child's biological parents. Why is creating a respectful relationship important in these types of situations? And that also goes back to the intervention that we're looking at, and what are some things that might make that challenging, and why is it so important to have that kind of relationship with the parents?